Good afternoon and welcome to our second seminar in our Intellectual Property and Commercialisation seminar series. Just as a brief overview, firstly, 2 weeks ago we presented our first seminar, which was an introduction to intellectual property and commercialisation here at the Westmead Precinct. And I guess for those of you who missed that session, that has been recorded and we will make that available soon up on the Research Hub website, and we'll forward that out to everyone once that content has been loaded up onto the site, and we'll be doing the same for all of the subsequent seminars. In today's seminar, we're going to take a deeper dive into protecting, managing and leveraging your intellectual property, and Nadia will introduce our two external speakers shortly. We then have a third seminar series planned in 2 weeks' time, which is focused on the legalities of commercialisation. We're going to take a look at some of the agreements and contracts involved in research and commercialisation, and some of the legal issues and policy issues that relate to those. And then we have a final seminar at this point in time, which is focused on getting investor ready with your intellectual property or research innovations, and this is going to be really focused around packaging your intellectual property, engaging with industry partners and commercialising it either through licenses or startup companies. And we'll talk about some of the funding options that are available to support commercialisation. So again, just to reintroduce the team here at Westmead, I'm David Markwell. I'm the Intellectual Property and Commercialisation Manager for the two hospitals, Western Sydney Local Health District and the Sydney Children's Hospital Network. We've got Julia Hill, who looks after the Children's Medical Research Institute here, and Nadia Peche-Barbara, who looks after the University of Sydney and Westmead Institute for Medical Research. And I'm going to hand over now to Nadia to introduce our external speakers. Yes.
So welcome again, everybody. We are very fortunate today to have two guest speakers, both senior associates from FPA patent attorneys. FPA have done quite a significant amount of work for the University of Sydney, and they're one of our trusted service providers in this area. Both Dr. Sarah Hennebury and Dr. Milena Drizza have extensive experience across the life sciences, as you can see, in a number of different areas. And a lot of these areas are very relevant to a lot of the work that's being done here at the Westmead Research Hub. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Sarah and Milena.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I'm just going to pop up very briefly and then disappear for 50% of the slides. So just very quickly to give you a little bit of context into my background. I completed my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Melbourne at the Bio21 Institute, and then did a 3-year postdoc at the Baker Institute, which is a heart and diabetes research institute in Melbourne. So my research background has been quite varied in that it's ranged from quite basic science, protein structure and function, understanding the evolution of a particular family of proteins, from bacteria through to humans, and then also quite a bit of work in the field of microbiology and in botany as well. So quite varied. And then my postdoc research was really taking more of a clinical focus on molecular biology, and there at the Baker Institute I worked in the Human Neurotransmitters Laboratory, investigating basically the molecular pathways governing sympathetic nervous system regulation. As a patent attorney, the work that I do is similarly quite varied and broad. Quite a bit of structural biology work in the antibody field. still touching on a bit of microbiology work today, but not as much, and then quite a bit of work in the pharmaceuticals and diagnostics space, and delving into plant technology periodically, but really much more of a focus on pharmaceuticals today. So I'll hand over to Milena. Next slide.
Hi everyone, thanks for having us. So my background, so I'll start at the beginning. I did an undergraduate degree in forensic and analytical chemistry because I thought I was going to be Dana Scully when I finished that degree. That did not happen, as you can see. So throughout that degree, I would have to say that my love of chemistry grew. And so then I did an honours degree in biochem, basically looking at the structure-function relationship between uridine glucuronyl transferases and various substrates that they metabolize. And then the part of my honours that involved making some of these substrates, I did in a very sort of pure synthetic organic chemistry natural products lab. And so that chemistry started to interest me, and so that's where I did my PhD in that area, so natural product synthesis. And then halfway through, I decided that maybe being in a lab wasn't really for me. And so I started to look at other ways I could use my science and my knowledge, because I love reading about science, but doing it wasn't really my thing, I think. And so, yeah, then I found patent attorneying, and so I've been doing that ever since. So I've been at FPA about 10 years, and Sarah, how long have you been there now?
Nearly 8.
Nearly 8. So yeah, and in my role at FPA, I do basically anything, as my boss says, that has to do with chicken wires. And so that's like the molecules, if you think about how compounds are drawn, Nichols and chicken wires. So yeah, anything organic chemistry, particularly pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals. I also do quite a bit in the food technology space, biochem, a bit of chemical materials engineering, analytical chemistry, and industrial chemistry. So that's my background. So now I'll move on to more interesting things. And so I guess today Sarah and I will broadly cover IP, but more specifically patents. And so I'll start off by discussing what is IP and why is it important. And you may have covered a little bit of this already in the previous talks, but I'll go into it in a little bit more detail here. So IP, or intellectual property, is basically property arising as a result of creations of the intellect. And while most people think of it as new ideas, new devices, new methods, equally valid forms of intellectual property include modifying existing things or improving them, okay? So those things are also protectable. It's important to understand IP for a number of reasons. One of the main ones is that to ensure that you have a respect for IP in terms of your own intellectual property, the university's intellectual property, and the intellectual property of others. So when you're engaged in collaborations, discussing your research at conferences and things like that, it's just important to be aware of where IP might fit into that, how you could use it, and how to make sure you don't compromise it. And the reason you want to be aware of that stuff is because IP is an asset. So it's property like other property. It can be sold, licensed, or exchanged. And I know you talked briefly about the 3 E's, I think, at the last seminar, but I'll just go through them again. So there's exclusivity, and it's also enabling and engaging. So in exclusivity, what that means is if you've got IP that's your own and you haven't divulged it to the public, haven't discussed it with anybody, it provides almost like an incentive for a collaborator to come and speak to you because you own that intellectual property. And so that's where they're going to get that exclusivity. If they go to another person down the road, they're not going to get that same knowledge exchange. It's also enabling. It provides researchers, which people don't often think about, a bit of a quality control aspect as well. So if you've got IP and that you've contributed to a project, you have a say potentially in how that project's run. It provides you with options to expand into other research areas and into other markets, if you've got a product, for example. And it's engaging because it makes, if you've got a document that describes your project or your intellectual property, it makes the beginnings of the collaboration quite clear-cut and simple, and people quite like that because they know where they're starting from and what they can build on. It also provides a funding opportunity from industry and government, and that's always a bonus. And as I flagged just before, you can use your innovations to engage and collaborate with other researchers and academics, with other institutes, and of course with industry as well. And I should mention also, as I'm going along, if you have any questions, just feel free to chime in at any time. Okay, so this slide kind of goes through the different types of IP, but from the context of how it may be relevant to what you're doing in your day-to-day work. So some of this may be relevant, some of it may not, but we'll just give you a broad overview. So for example, if you're working on new compounds, new methods of making compounds, this might be pharmaceuticals we're talking about, new process of treating patients, if you're working on a new method for treatment for a particular condition, that can be covered by a patent. So these things are commonly called inventions, and they're protectable by a patent. So there should be a little arrow there, but that's okay. The other aspect of this, which people don't often realise is also intellectual property, is this confidential information or know-how or trade secrets. And that really is kind of the human capital component that you bring to any collaboration, because you yourself will have particular intimate knowledge of how this technology works, how you can make it better, and you'll know all these little ins and outs. So Sarah and I were talking about this before, and you may, for example, put in your patent specification how to obtain a particular antibody. You put the sequencing, you put in the general methods for culturing it and then extracting it and purifying it. But there may be particular little nuances of that process that only you really know about and that are very invaluable to a potential collaborator. The other sort of way that I like to view trade secrets is, I remember there was a guy from 3M who's, I think, is the head of their product development, and he said, everyone knows about our glue, for the post-it notes. We patent it, so that means it becomes public knowledge. Anyone can read about how to make it, etc. But he said, for me, the most important trade secret is actually how I configure my production lines. So where I put my glue, how that glue goes onto the pieces of paper, how the pieces of paper are put together. So that's another aspect of know-how and trade secrets that you wouldn't put into a patent specification, and you maybe wouldn't want to. But that's the sort of information that can be really invaluable to a commercial partner. Software, that can be protected by automatic forms of protection, such as copyright and circuit layouts, so you don't have to actually apply for those. They're automatic. New shapes and looks of things can be protected by designs, logos and brand names, obviously trademarks, and new plant varieties also have a particular special form of protection in the form of plant breeders' rights. And of course you can use more than one type of IP protection to protect your innovation. This is another way to visualise some of the common IP outputs that you might be generating. It talks about the registrable ones, so such as designs, trademarks, patents, and also the non-registrable IP rights, and also gives you a bit of more information about the other IP outputs, so the confidential information, you know how, and your trade secrets as well. Okay, so moving on to patents. I'll just make sure I've talked about everything I need to talk about before I move on. Okay. So patents are not a positive right, they're actually a negative right. So what that means is it gives you the right to exclude other people from using your invention. It doesn't give you the right to use your invention. That's how they work. The quid pro quo is that in exchange for giving you 20-year exclusive monopoly, you have to teach the world how to work your invention. So when you read a patent specification, it'll have at length descriptions of all the different variables and different ways you can do this step and that step, or different groups that group X may be. And then there'll be examples in there as well which tell a person who's reading the specification how to actually carry out your invention. And that's quite important actually, because you have to make sure that in there is your best method for performing your invention. And that can be quite important later down the track. So yeah, that's kind of the exchange, and that's quite an important aspect of patenting. So it gives you a 20-year term, which can be up to 25 years for pharmaceutical patents. So you can get an extension if you get an approved pharmaceutical approved by the TGA in Australia. And in order to get a patent, you must have, first of all, an invention, and that's, in some countries, certain inventions are patentable, in other countries, others are not. And so Sarah will talk a little bit about that later on. And your invention must also be new, what they call novel, so nothing exactly like it can have been done before. And I'll talk about what before means in a minute. And even if it's a bit different to what's been done before, it's not allowed to be obvious in light of what's been done before. And it must have a use. And that's often referred to as sort of industrial applicability. All right. So this provides a little bit of an overview of how the patent system works. So you have your IP development phase here, where you're creating your invention, doing your experiments, etc. You work out that you've got something really special, something that's worth protecting. And usually the first step is to file a basic application, which is called a provisional. And that essentially starts the clock for your patenting process. So over the next 12 months or so, you might refine your invention, you might do some more experiments, gather some more data. And then at 12 months, if you want to keep protection for that invention going, you have to file what's called a complete application. And that's the application that's going to form the basis for your patent. So that's, once you file that, that's what you've got to work with. Now, before we go to publication, I should mention here there's a couple of ways to file the complete application. So you can either file into each country individually. So for example, you might determine that your most important market is in the US, in Europe and in China. So you'd file application into those countries at 12 months. Or at 12 months, you might not yet know which markets you want to go into, or you might not yet have a partner to help you with maybe the costs further down the line. And at that point, what you can do as an alternative of going into each separate country is what you can do is you can file an application called a PCT application, and that's an international application. And what happens is that gets filed and it sits there for quite a while. At 18 months, it will publish. So whatever was in your provisional application as well as your complete application will publish, and that's important. Sarah will talk about that a little bit later on. You can pull your application from the system before it publishes. So one other advantage of filing a PCT, so an international application rather than going into all the separate countries, is that you get an examination that happens as well. And if you find some documents in there which mean that your invention's not new, you can pull your application at that point and say, look, we don't want to pursue this, and it won't publish, so no one will know what your thing's about, apart from what's on the title, but that's based on the provisional. But that point is also important because it's publication not only of your invention, but potentially all the other patent applications that may be relevant to your invention will also publish 18 months after they've been filed. So there's a bit of a zone of where if you do a search, for example, before you file your provisional application to see what else is out there and what other people have done, you won't know at that point whether someone's filed something similar because it wouldn't have yet published, potentially. So that's also something to be aware of, and Sarah will mention that a little bit later on. Whoops, gone the wrong way. Then at 30 months from when you filed your provisional application, that's when it's time for your PCT application to be filed in each of the countries that you choose. So it gives you an extra 18 months in effect over the other route of filing an application. And it's at that point then that once you've filed into all the different countries, that's when the patent examiners pick up the application and start the examination, go through examination, and then eventually, sometimes it can take a really long time for that whole process to happen. It can take up to 7 to 10 years from when you filed your provisional application to when you get a granted patent out of this thing. So it can be quite a long process. You'll hear from us a lot in terms of patent attorneys before you file your provisional. We'll be talking to you a lot about things at that point. Then probably sort of between when you file that and when the complete application is filed, we'll talk to you a lot about things then as well. And then you probably won't really hear from us until you get well down the track here and it begins to go into examination, and we have to talk to examiners, look at the documents they've put up to say, your invention's not novel, your invention's not inventive, etc. And we'll be potentially corresponding with you a fair bit then to get your opinion on what those documents actually disclose and whether they're relevant. And most of the time the examiners are wrong, so that's always nice. So we might as well, in sort of preparing this talk, we wanted to also go through and talk about some fact and fiction scenarios about questions that we hear a lot from researchers. So there's always this one: you can get a worldwide patent. And as I've just discussed in the previous slide, there is a worldwide application that you can file, but you ultimately have to go into each country separately. And so that's a fiction. So working with patent attorneys, I've touched on this a little bit already, and Sarah and I have explained sort of, so we're basically legal professionals with a technical qualification, and we're engaged by the commercialisation team to work at different stages of the patenting process. And we're usually selected based on our background in the particular technical field of your invention. So we always try to find someone who's going to understand your work. The first step usually involves conducting a patentability assessment, and that basically means we'll look at what's been published before. Sorry, I think I kind of skipped over this, but going back. So at point 0 there, where you file your basic application, before that point, anything that's in the public domain, journal articles, talks, TV shows, anything that's been published will be used to assess the novelty and inventiveness of your invention. So when we talk about examination and prior art, etc., we're talking about things generally that have been published before you filed your provisional application. So that's what your invention's assessed against. So when you do your patentability assessment here, when we do that, what we're looking at is anything that's been published up until that point in the general area of your invention, to see whether you've got something new and inventive in light of what's been done before. We then work with you, provided that's fine, we then work with you on drafting a patent application, and then further down the track, we also work with you when we have to liaise with various examiners and argue with them about why your invention is novel and inventive. So throughout this process, we will generally ask you things such as what's the technical significance of your invention, what are the advantages of your invention, and how is your invention different to what's been done before or what's in the prior art. Anything else, sorry, you want to mention there in terms of? No? Okay, so I'll hand it over to Sarah now, who will talk about a few sort of aspects of patent protection that we often get questions about from researchers. Thanks, Sarah. Did you want my notes or you?
Oh, yeah,
just in case. I'll flip them for you so you can. That's right.
Okay, so often in the course of drafting a patent application, what we find that a lot of inventors have is a draft manuscript for submission to a journal, or are about to put together a manuscript for submission to a journal. And that typically then leads to the question of who's going to be an inventor named on the patent application that gets filed. And importantly, inventorship is not the same as authorship. And so whoever is listed as an author on that draft manuscript will not necessarily be named as an inventor on the patent application. And that's really important because I know, having gone through the experience of wanting to get my publication record up, that there's a lot of emotion associated with being listed as an author on a paper, and there's a lot of reasons for that because funding is very much dictated by whether or not you've got X number of papers in X number of high impact journals. But inventorship is a specific legal concept which is quite different. At a really superficial level, the order of inventors on a patent application makes absolutely no difference. From a patent perspective, whoever is listed as an inventor is considered to have made an equal contribution. Where you might find that there are considerations of the percentage contribution, that generally relates to things that Nadia's probably spoken to you about in terms of the royalty contributions that might come from any monies earned from licensing a patent on which you're an inventor. So an inventor is somebody who has contributed intellectually to the invention, and we talk about inventorship as being a but-for test. So but for the intellectual contribution of this individual, you wouldn't have arrived at the particular invention, and typically it's more than one person. But it's quite different to authorship on a journal article where you might have a number of people who are technicians or honours students or even postdocs who are performing tasks that have been designed and considered important by somebody else in the lab. And so those people who are just following instructions, basically, would not be considered inventors in a typical scenario. So as I mentioned, an inventor is somebody who has intellectual domination over the inventive process and not merely somebody who assists in reduction to practice. Another way to think of it is if you could have asked somebody else to perform that same experiment or gone to a different lab to run a series of experiments, could you have still got to the invention, even if it was a little bit difficult? You know, it might not have been as convenient to work with this particular collaborator. It might have cost you a bit more money. Those are all things that you generally want to think about when considering inventorship versus authorship. The other reason why inventorship is important is because ultimately it determines who the applicants on a patent application will be. And if a patent application is filed with the wrong applicant or somebody who's not entitled to that invention, that can invalidate any patent that's granted. And so it's really important, particularly at that PCT stage that Milena was talking about, that there is a consideration of who the inventors are and consequently who the applicants on a patent application will be. And the final point that I want to make there is that this question is complicated by the fact that the answer isn't clear cut and the answer will vary from country to country. And so this is why people get a little bit nervous when they start talking about who the inventors are. And generally speaking, we try and err on the side of caution, yes, oftentimes patent attorneys are asked to assist in performing an inventorship determination, which is separate to the tasks that we would perform in terms of drafting a patent application. So you'll hear this every time you talk to a patent attorney probably, and any time you're talking about patents. But publications are a major issue in terms of trying to get your inventions protected and making sure that you haven't inadvertently disclosed your invention before you've had an opportunity to file your provisional application. And there is a lot of debate as to what actually constitutes a publication or a public disclosure of your invention. And so pretty much any public disclosure that you can think of could potentially amount to a publication that would destroy the novelty or the inventiveness of your patent application. And again, this will vary from country to country. And so this is why patent attorneys get nervous, because they want to make sure that we're minimising risk at all times. But pretty much any public disclosure could jeopardise the opportunity to get a patent granted. So this could be anything from a journal article, like I just talked about, a poster presentation at a conference, or even within sort of an institute seminar series. If the poster contains details of your invention and it's published online, for example, or published as part of a abstract series in a scientific journal, that can potentially be identified during examination of your patent application and considered in an assessment of novelty and inventive step. Talking at interdepartmental seminars, particularly where you have external people coming in. This is a slightly different scenario in that it's less likely that during examination somebody's going to identify a piece of paper that documents exactly what you spoke about at the seminar, but it runs the risk of somebody sitting in the audience and going, I understand what they're doing, they're just about to do this, or they're just about to file this. I'm going to run off and do my own little thing and get a patent application in before you've had a chance to do it. And so this is an important concept because previously the US was a standalone really jurisdiction where they didn't have what we call a first to file patent regime. Nowadays, all countries are first to file, so whoever files their patent application first gets to draw the line in the sand in terms of when something's considered new and inventive. Previously in the US, it didn't matter who filed the application first, it mattered who could show that they had reduced an invention to practice. And so many of you might have heard about the interference proceedings in the US in relation to the CRISPR technology. So that's one of the very last cases in the US where it wasn't under the first to file regime, but rather the first to invent regime. So it's very important to make sure that if you are considering filing a patent application, that you make sure that nobody's got in there before you. And as Milena alluded to earlier as well, you might not know who's filing around the same time as you, because there'll be an 18-month lag period before their application is published. So again, greater reason to try and get the timing right in terms of when you give your presentation and when you file your patent application. And I'll come back to that. Trade displays, this is a sort of disclosure that typically applies to electronics and device spaces. But again, worth reiterating the point that this is a form of public disclosure that could be detrimental to your opportunity to get a patent application granted. Field trials, now I've got an actual field up there. It could be that kind of a field trial, but it could also be a clinical trial, depending on the type of information that's given to the participants in the trial. I was involved in a case a number of years ago where a clinical trial was being considered as a potential novelty destroying, so the documentation associated with that clinical trial was considered in an examination and had been raised by a third party trying to stop somebody's patent from getting granted. And in that particular case, we argued that there was no information in the document that would enable the skilled person to say, okay, well, I know what was in the formulation that was given to me. I know what the invention was. All they knew was that there was a bit of gel being put on their skin. They didn't know what it was. But the point is that clinical trials are another potential source of disclosing your invention. So you need to be very careful in terms of the confidentiality regimes that are in place and what type of documentation is being provided to the participants. And your thesis is another publication, and we routinely see PhD, Masters and Honours theses being cited as relevant prior art during the examination of a patent application. Sometimes it is possible for a thesis to be kept under embargo, particularly if the student is anticipating filing a patent application or knows that that's forthcoming. So that's a question that you can ask the commercialisation team here. So going back to this sort of fact or fiction myth-busting approach that Milan and I were talking about, a lot of people think that standing up at a conference and talking about your work isn't a publication because it's not a piece of paper. And unfortunately, that's fiction. So again, talking about publishing, another myth and another fiction that people talk about a lot in terms of patenting arises from this concern that if you patent or if you file a patent application, that actually stops you from publishing and hinders your publication efforts, which are important, as we discussed. The first point that I'll make there is that a patent publishes. And as Mel showed in that timeline, at 18 months a patent application will publish if you let it get that far. And so patent applications do contribute to your publication efforts, full stop. But also you can be publishing in journal articles at the same time. The most important thing is to get the timing right. So these activities are not mutually exclusive. And I have to say that my own experience of working with people who file patent applications regularly is that they also have quite an extensive non-patent publication record. And really that just comes about from having an open dialogue with the relevant commercialisation people within the institute or the university, and making sure that whenever something comes off the rack, so to speak, in terms of a potential patentable invention or the next planned manuscript or journal article, that there's a conversation there where IP can be captured before the journal article gets published. So the timing thing here is really critical. People think that filing patent applications slows everything down, and the reality is that we file applications with minimal notice, often because we get a phone call from a client saying, oh, you know, I've got a conference that I want to go and speak at, I've got this thing coming up that I want to talk to investors about, or I found out that my student submitted this particular abstract and it's about to publish. And so we're very much used to getting a hold of what the invention is, working with the inventors and drafting a patent application in a very short period of time. We've done it in days, a couple of weeks. I know that's not the ideal situation, certainly not for the commercialisation team here, but it can be done. That's the only thing I wanted to emphasise. And also the thing to remember is that journal articles go through a review process before they get published, and my own unfortunate experience was that often that required submitting to a few different journals before I actually got the publication. And so that is time when you could be talking to a patent attorney and refining a patent application. Now ideally you would file a patent application before you submit the manuscript for review. But the reality is that often the patent application gets filed after the manuscript's been reviewed and has been accepted and is just about to publish. So you've got quite a bit of extra time if you think of it that way. And similarly, when it comes to conferences, I mean, there's usually quite a bit of lead time as to when you're going to go to a conference, when you're going to submit an abstract, when that gets published. And so these are all, you know, just times which should just ring a little light bulb in your head. Maybe I should speak to the commercialisation team now and talk about whether or not there's something here that I can protect and get into a patent application before I've disclosed elsewhere.
Sarah, can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Also, even though we know that you can work under pressure really quickly, and we've had you do that in the past, you have to bear in mind that we also have to make the decision to file the patent.
Yes.
And that's where some of the delays can occur, and that's why we want you to engage with us early, because it's not up to us necessarily to make that decision. on whether or not we are going to file that patent application or not. So we need to have that leeway and that time to make that decision, and that's where you have to keep that in mind.
Yep. All right. So take-home message really is just getting the order right. File the application first, then publish. And actually, before I go further, just one last little myth that I just want to address is this concept of a grace period. A lot of people say sort of flippantly, oh, it doesn't matter, there's a grace period in Australia, so I can use that to basically exclude my publication from the prior art for my patent application. Grace periods are limited. They do exist in Australia and the US and a couple of other countries, but they don't exist everywhere, and Europe is a very important jurisdiction where there is no grace period. And so while it is possible to rely on a grace period in certain circumstances, it's certainly not something that you want to be relying on. And in my experience, where there is a document that's relevant to your invention that's been published before you've had a chance to patent, the chances are you've got other disclosures out there that are going to also be a problem. And where there's a document that's in isolation, that's less significant to your invention, the chances are it may not be an enabling disclosure, it might not completely destroy the novelty of your invention. But suffice to say, it would not rely on a grace period, certainly a last resort. So we've been talking about what prior art is, and Mel has covered some of this already. But prior art is pretty much any publication that contains information that can be used to assess, is your invention novel? Is it inventive? And the other thing that I'll talk about here just very briefly, in a patent application, and as Mel mentioned as well, there's lots of words.
Words.
It's just a lot of explanation, and I mean, even for us when we read it, we'll read two sentences and say, is that saying the same thing? But actually they'll be saying something very close but slightly different, and there are reasons for that. But when your patent application is being assessed for novelty and inventiveness, what is being assessed are the claims at the end of your patent application. So it's right at the end, listed 1 through however many, and they're discrete statements of what the invention is. So it could be a method of treating disease X comprising administering compound Y, or an antibody having these particular CDR sequences, or a chemical compound with these different R groups. So that's what's being assessed. So prior art that's going to be relevant to that assessment is your prior art, and also prior art usually of your competitors, and oftentimes there is prior art that none of us will be aware of, even after doing the patentability assessment, even after talking to you, until that international stage, the PCT application, and that examination is performed. And often it can be journal articles from non-English speaking countries that we just wouldn't have found in our typical searches as well. Did we skip a slide? We did. I was just going to go back to Mel's previous slide.
Oh, with the timeline.
Yeah, with the timeline in there. Go back, just to make the point. Which, yeah, just here. So, your claims, those patent claims, will be considered at this time point here. And so any prior art that's before here will be relevant prior art for novelty and inventive step. And as I said, that's your prior art and the prior art of others. And it can be things like conference abstracts and abstracts in proceedings for seminars. All sorts of things can be considered relevant and dug out by examiners. So lastly, just ignore the protein. So Mel mentioned earlier that in order to get a patent, you have to have an invention. And what is an invention, what is patentable subject matter, is generally speaking the same in most countries, but there can be some subtle differences. And so just to finalise or finish up today, I just wanted to run through the sorts of things that are generally patentable. So new chemical compounds can be pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, processes for making these, or improved processes that sort of result in increased efficiencies or increased purities for any of those compounds. New formulations, so for particular pharmaceuticals, a formulation that results in increased solubility of the active, extended release formulations, all those sorts of things could be patentable subject matter in pretty much every jurisdiction. Transgenic organisms, now I've got a green tick there, but actually that's less clear. In most of the main jurisdictions, it is possible to get a patent to these sorts of subject matter. Plants, there are some exclusions in, particularly in South America, is my recent experience, and in some Southeast Asian countries. And plants, importantly, can be protected both with a patent application and with a plant breeder's right. Again, depending on the country, so in Australia you can get both, in New Zealand you can only get one or the other. Microorganisms are patentable. Generally speaking, if you're trying to patent a microorganism, you'll need to provide a deposit of that to a relevant institute, because how do you describe a new organism in a patent application? If you can't describe it with words, generally speaking, you need to provide a sample of it. Seeds are another example. So if you've got a seed corresponding to a particularly genetically modified crop, that's the sort of thing that would get deposited to an institute. And then the accession number for that deposit would be referred to in the patent application. All right, so devices, probably not the sort of thing that would be necessarily relevant to the work that you're doing, but electronics, machines, appliances. Methods of medical treatment, generally speaking, yes. And even if we can't get a claim that says a method of treating disease Y, there are ways of getting around that in other countries. So for example, in Europe, method claims aren't allowable, but it is possible to get what's called a second medical use claim, where the claim basically defines the compound or the formulation for a specific use that can include a treatment. But the method language is generally limited to Australia and the US. Methods of diagnosis. So this is something that we deal with quite a bit actually at the moment. In most countries it is possible to get methods of diagnosis. China is quite difficult, and I would say almost impossible. US is increasingly difficult, but that's not to say that it's impossible, and it really depends on where you are in terms of the diagnosis. If it's a new way of detecting a particular biomarker, so a new spectrophotometric technique, that probably would be patentable in the US. If it's merely associating a particular biomarker with a disease state, that's going to be very difficult to get through in the US unless the method is framed in a different way. So one of the approaches is to claim a method of medical treatment. So in the US you might say a method of treating such and such disease, wherein the treatment includes a diagnosis step that involves X, Y, and Z. So these are sorts of things that really need to be considered on a case-by-case basis, but certainly I would say if you've got something in the diagnostic space, don't assume that you can't get a patent in the US. There are certainly ways around it, and that's something that you need to talk to the commercialisation team and to your patent attorneys about. So back to my protein. Naturally occurring substances, nucleic acids and proteins. Again, a little bit iffy. It depends on the specific language that's used. So sometimes you'll see the word isolated, synthetic, recombinant used in order to make a distinction. But also, if you can argue that just by virtue of the particular sequence of the nucleic acid or the protein that it does not exist in nature, that can be a way to overcome any objection that it's a naturally occurring substance and therefore not patentable. Almost universally, ideas, schemes and plans, business methods, algorithms, these are not considered patentable subject matter. Might be protectable by copyright in some instances, but just a treatment plan, for example, wouldn't be, or a dietary plan would not be considered patentable subject matter. And so that's where I'll finish off, and I'll hand over to Julia to do a final wrap-up. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you both of you for giving us a very informative overview of the patenting process, what is patentable, what isn't. Hopefully everybody feels a bit more confident about what constitutes inventorship versus authorship, and also public disclosures.